The morning Clara Whitfield rode into Dusty Creek, New Mexico territory. The year was 1883, and the summer heat was already sitting on the land like a punishment from God. She had not planned to stop in Dusty Creek. She had not planned much of anything beyond getting as far from Santa Fe as her sorrel mare could carry her before her legs gave out or her resolve did, whichever came first. The valise strapped to the back of the saddle held everything she owned in this world. 2 dresses, a tortoiseshell comb her mother had given her, a small Bible with a cracked spine, and $43.20 she had earned over 4 years of working in the home of Gerald Whitfield, her late husband, who had not been kind and had not been patient, and had finally, mercifully, been laid in the ground 2 months ago after a dispute with a man at a card table went in a direction Gerald had not anticipated. Clara was 24 years old. She had been widowed for 8 weeks, and she had spent all 8 of those weeks being told by Gerald's mother, his brothers, and the men at the law office that nothing in the estate was hers, that Gerald had seen to it, and that she would do well to remarry quickly, because a woman alone was not a circumstance that society in Santa Fe would tolerate with any particular grace. She had taken the $43 from a housekeeping tin that Gerald's mother did not know about, saddled the mare before dawn on a Tuesday, and ridden south and then east until the familiar adobe rooftops of Santa Fe disappeared behind the hills. Dusty Creek was not a town that advertised its own existence with any particular enthusiasm. There was a main street that ran about 200 yards from one end to the other, flanked by a general store, a saloon, a livery stable, a small church with a bell tower that leaned slightly to the left, a barber, a telegraph office, and a boarding house with a hand-painted sign that read ROOMS available, MEALS included, no trouble welcomed. There was a blacksmith at the far end, and beyond that, the land opened back up into the broad tan flatness of the high desert with the San Andres Mountains stacking up purple and distant to the east. Clara pulled her mare to a stop in front of the livery stable because the animal had been walking for the better part of 2 days, and she deserved rest more than Clara did. A boy of about 14 came out of the stable doors wiping his hands on a rag and squinting up at her. "$1 a night, ma'am, includes water and hay," he said with the matter-of-fact authority of a boy who had given this speech 100 times. "That will do," Clara said, and she climbed down from the saddle and her knees buckled slightly before she caught herself on the stirrup. She had not eaten since yesterday morning. She paid the boy and took her valise and walked toward the boarding house because it was the most obvious destination, and she did not have the energy for anything less obvious. The woman who answered the boarding house door was named Mrs. Eliza Greer. She was perhaps 50, with iron-gray hair pinned in a practical knot, sharp black eyes that missed nothing, and the solid, capable presence of a woman who had outlasted hard circumstances by refusing to acknowledge them as anything other than inconveniences. She looked at Clara for a long moment, taking in the dusty dress, the dark circles under her eyes, the grip she had on her valise like someone might try to take it. "You just passing through, or are you looking to stay a while?" Mrs. Greer asked. "I don't know yet," Clara said honestly. Mrs. Greer seemed to respect this answer more than a definitive one would have earned. She held the door open wider. "Come in, then. Supper is at 6 o'clock and breakfast is at 7, and I don't hold either one for anyone. Room's $4 a week. There's a wash basin upstairs." Clara had never slept so deeply or so gratefully as she slept that first night in Dusty Creek. The room was small and clean with a white cotton curtain at the window and an iron bed frame with a quilt that smelled faintly of cedar, and she pulled that quilt up to her chin and was unconscious before the sun had fully finished setting. She woke to the sound of the town beginning its day and lay there for a moment listening to it, the creak of wagon wheels on packed dirt, the distant hammer of the blacksmith, a rooster who was several minutes late in his announcement of morning, and underneath all of it, the wind moving steadily across the high desert with a dry, clean persistence that was nothing like the smothering warmth of Santa Fe in summer. This wind had distance in it. It had space. Clara sat up in bed, and for the first time in a very long time, she did not immediately feel dread. She went downstairs for breakfast and found herself at a long table with 3 other boarders. A land surveyor named Fletcher who was working on something to do with railroad expansion and seemed very important about it. A schoolteacher named Miss Audrey Holt, who was young and earnest and already had ink on her fingers at 7 in the morning, and an older man named Pete Dawson who ate his eggs in silence and appeared to have no further agenda for the day than that. Mrs. Greer brought eggs and biscuits and black coffee and sat at the head of the table and conducted the morning with the efficiency of a general managing a campaign. It was at breakfast that the name Eli Calloway first came up, and it came up the way significant things often do, sideways and without ceremony. Fletcher was complaining about the difficulty of getting accurate surveys done when half the ranchers in the territory were in some kind of ongoing disagreement with one another, and Mrs. Greer cut him off by saying, "If you want a man who actually knows this land and won't get himself shot for trespassing, you do well to talk to Eli Calloway. He's been running cattle up in the north pasture of the Brennan spread for 3 years, and there's not a rock formation or a water source within 40 miles that he couldn't draw you from memory." Fletcher wrote the name down. Clara drank her coffee and did not write it down because she had no reason to, but she remembered it anyway, the way you remember the shape of a cloud that catches your eye even when you're not looking for anything in particular. The morning after that breakfast, Clara walked to the general store to buy a bar of soap and a small tin of tooth powder, and she was standing at the counter waiting for the proprietor, a Mr. Amos Peel, to finish wrapping her purchases, when the front door opened and a man came in out of the morning light, and the light came in with him, and then he closed the door and took his hat off. He was tall, which was the first thing anyone would have noticed, not unusually so but enough that he had to be conscious of door frames. He was lean in the way men get lean when they work hard outdoors for years, with the kind of economy of movement that comes from knowing exactly what your body is for. He had dark hair that was a little too long at the back of his neck, a jaw with about 2 days of dark stubble on it, and eyes that were a color Clara couldn't immediately name, somewhere between brown and green, the color of the desert after rain, the kind of color that doesn't show up in daylight and then suddenly does. He put his hat on the counter and said to Amos Peel, "I need a spool of fence wire and whatever you've got in the way of carbolic salve. One of my hands got himself tangled in the old south fence." "That'll be a minute," Amos said, and disappeared into the back. The man glanced sideways at Clara in the way people do when they're sharing a counter and being polite about the proximity, and he offered the brief, non-committal nod that passed for greeting between strangers in small western towns. Clara nodded back. And then, because the silence felt slightly loaded in a way she couldn't account for, she said, "You're Eli Calloway." He looked at her more directly then, with a slight raise of one brow that wasn't quite surprise but was adjacent to it. "I am." "You have the advantage of me. Clara Whitfield," she said. "I'm staying at Mrs. Greer's. She mentioned your name at breakfast yesterday." "Eliza has strong opinions about what people ought to be doing," he said, and there was something in his voice that wasn't quite amusement but had warmth in it. "You passing through?" "I don't know yet," she said, and she realized it was the second time she had given that answer to someone in Dusty Creek, and it was no less honest the second time. He looked at her for a moment with those rain-colored eyes, and she had the unsettling impression that he understood more about what she meant by that than he had any right to from those 4 words. Amos came back with the fence wire, and the salve in the conversation closed the way small conversations in general stores do, with the transaction completing and both parties going back to their respective mornings. Eli Calloway put his hat on and walked out with his fence wire over one shoulder and his salve in his coat pocket, and Clara took her soap and her tooth powder and went back to the boarding house. She thought about those eyes for longer than she thought was warranted. The following week, Clara began to understand that $43 would not sustain her indefinitely in Dusty Creek, and she was going to need to find some way to contribute to her own survival. She was not a woman who frightened easily in practical terms. She had kept Gerald's household running for 4 years without adequate funds and with very little cooperation from Gerald himself, and she was accustomed to making do. She went to the schoolhouse and asked Audrey Holt whether there was any need for an assistant, and Audrey said yes with the unguarded enthusiasm of someone who has been doing too much alone for too long. The Dusty Creek schoolhouse had 22 children between the ages of 6 and 14, and it was Audrey's entire universe. Clara began helping 3 mornings a week, managing the younger students while Audrey worked with the older ones, and Mrs. Greer reduced her room rate to $3 a week in recognition of the fact that Clara was also helping in the boarding house kitchen most evenings. It wasn't wealth, but it was enough, and more importantly, it was hers. She learned the rhythms of the town. She learned that the saloon, which was called the Dusty Spur, was run by a man named Roy Hatch, who was generally decent if you treated him decently, and would not tolerate fighting on his premises, which kept the peace better than the law did because the law in Dusty Creek was represented by a deputy named Cal Briggs who was earnest but somewhat easily confused. She learned that the main tension in the county was between 2 ranching operations, the Brennan spread to the north, which was established and well-run, and where Eli Calloway worked as foreman, and the Decker operation to the southeast, which was newer and more aggressive and whose owner, a man named Walt Decker, had a habit of letting his cattle drift across other people's fence lines and then being surprised about it. She also learned that Eli Calloway came into town on Fridays to collect the week's mail and buy whatever the ranch needed from the general store, and that he had coffee at Mrs. Greer's boarding house dining room on those Friday mornings, because he had been doing so since before Mrs. Greer's husband had passed away 3 years ago, and the habit had the quality of loyalty rather than convenience. Clara was helping Mrs. Greer with the breakfast dishes on the 3rd Friday after her arrival when Eli came in, and this time he took off his hat and sat down at the table and said good morning to both of them, and Mrs. Greer brought him coffee without being asked because that was how it was between them. And then Mrs. Greer was called to the front of the house by something, and Clara was still at the wash basin with her back to the room, and Eli said, "You're still here." "I am," she said. "Have you decided yet about whether you're staying?" She turned around with a wet dishcloth in her hand and looked at him. He was sitting with his long hands wrapped around the coffee cup and his hat on the chair beside him, and he was looking at her with a directness that was not unkind. And she had the sudden clear thought that this man did not ask questions he wasn't genuinely curious about the answers to. "I think I might be," she said. "The town seems to suit me." "The town's nothing special," he said, "but the land around it is. What's special about the land?" He was quiet for a moment in the way of a man considering how to explain something he's felt more than thought. "It doesn't make promises it can't keep," he finally said. "The land out here is exactly what it is. It's hard and it's dry and it's beautiful and it doesn't pretend otherwise. There's something restful about that." Clara looked at him for a long beat. "I know what you mean," she said quietly, and she meant it in a way that went further than the land itself, and she thought from the slight change in his expression that he heard that. Mrs. Greer came back and the conversation became general again, but something had shifted between them in that kitchen in a way that was quiet and real, like a door opening onto a room you didn't know was there. The Friday visits continued. Clara began to understand that Eli Calloway was a man of considerable silence and considerable presence, which was a combination she found uncommon and compelling. He did not talk to fill space. When he spoke, it was because he had something to say, and when he listened with the kind of attention that made you feel that what you were saying was the most important thing being said anywhere. He was 28 years old, she learned, and had been working the Brennan spread since he was 20, having come up from Texas after a cattle drive that ended in Albuquerque, and never having found a compelling reason to turn around and go back south. He had a calm about him that was not the calm of someone to whom nothing had happened, but the calm of someone who had made peace with the things that had. She told him about Gerald slowly, in pieces, over several Fridays. Not the worst of it, not at first, but the shape of it, the suffocating smallness of a life that had been arranged without her genuine consent from the beginning. A match made when she was 19 between her father, who needed Gerald's money, and Gerald, who wanted the appearance of a respectable household, and Clara herself standing in the middle of it like furniture that had been nicely arranged in a room nobody lived in. Eli listened to all of this with his coffee cup in his hands and his eyes on her face, and when she was done he said, "I'm sorry you had 4 years of that." He didn't say anything about Gerald's death. He didn't ask what she felt about being free of it. He just offered the sorrow for the years themselves, cleanly and without judgment, and Clara felt something in her chest loosen that had been tight for a very long time. "You're the first person who said that to me," she said. "Said what?" "That they're sorry for the years. Everyone else has been sorry about the death, or not sorry at all, or sorry that it had to happen the way it did. No one said they were sorry for the time it cost." Eli looked at her steadily. "That's the thing worth being sorry for," he said. She thought about him when he wasn't there, which she recognized as a significant development. By September, the air had gone crisp, and the high desert had taken on a different quality, the sharp blue of the sky deepening, and the mountains going from purple to gray as the distances changed with the angle of the light. The children at the schoolhouse came in wearing heavier coats, and Audrey Holt put up maps on the walls and began a unit on the geography of the territory that Clara found herself genuinely fascinated by, staying after the morning session to trace the river courses with her finger, while the light came in yellow and late through the windows. It was on a Thursday afternoon in the first week of September that Clara decided to take her mare out for a ride south of town. She had been cooped up in the schoolhouse and the boarding house for long enough that the open land was calling her in a way she couldn't resist. She saddled up and rode south along the road that ran toward the Decker operation, not intending to go that far, just wanting to move through the open air with the wind in her face and the creak of the saddle under her. She was perhaps 3 miles south of town when the trouble found her, as it has a way of finding people who weren't looking for it. 2 of Decker's hands came up the road from the south, on a collision course with her path. She recognized them vaguely from having seen them in town. A bulky man named Sid who had a red beard and a habit of taking up more physical space than situations required, and a shorter, wiry man named Coot, whose disposition was the opposite of his name. They were not, in themselves, necessarily dangerous, but they were in a mood that Clara's instincts read immediately and accurately, that particular mood of men who have been drinking since noon and have decided that a woman riding alone is an opportunity for entertainment. Sid pulled his horse across the road in front of her, and Clara's mare stopped, nickering with nerves. "Well now," Sid said, with a wide smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Where's a pretty thing like you headed out here all by yourself?" "I'm headed back to town," Clara said, keeping her voice level, "if you'll clear the road." "Oh, we're in no hurry," Coot said, coming up on her left. "There's no reason you have to be either." Clara's hands tightened on the reins and she was calculating her options, which were not numerous and none of which she liked, when she heard hoofbeats from the north, coming fast, and she looked back over her shoulder and saw a dark horse coming hard down the road with Eli Calloway on it. He came in like the road belonged to him, which, she thought later, was simply his natural relationship with open land. He pulled up beside Clara and looked at Sid and then at Coot with an expression that was perfectly neutral in a way that was somehow more authoritative than anger. "Afternoon, Sid," he said. "Coot." There was a significant pause. "Calloway," Sid said, and his wide smile had gone somewhat uncertain. "You're in the road," Eli said. Another pause. Sid looked at Coot. Coot looked at the pommel of his saddle. Sid moved his horse off to the side. Eli didn't thank him or acknowledge the movement. He simply looked at Clara and said, "Shall we head back?" "Yes," she said. They rode back toward town at an easy pace for a while before Clara's hands stopped shaking. She became aware that they were shaking when Eli pulled his horse up alongside hers at a walk and looked over at her hands on the reins. "You're shaking," he said softly. She looked at her hands. She looked at his face. And something extraordinary happened in that moment, something she could not have predicted and could not have manufactured. She was not afraid anymore. The shaking was still there, but it wasn't fear driving it. It was the release of fear, the physical aftermath of a body that had been braced for something terrible and was now, in the presence of this quiet and steady man riding beside her in the late September light, standing down. "I'm not afraid," she said, and her voice was steady even as her hands weren't. "I don't know why I'm still shaking. I'm not afraid." He held her gaze for a moment with those rain-colored eyes, and something in his expression was careful and tender in a way she had not yet seen from him. "Sometimes the body takes a moment to believe what the rest of you already knows," he said. They rode on. Clara became aware of the distance between them on the road as a palpable thing, close enough for comfort, far enough for propriety, and she thought about how deliberate that seemed for a man who placed himself in space with such precision. "How did you come to be on that road?" she asked. "Amos at the general store saw you ride out that way and mentioned it," he said, "and I had business in that direction anyway." She looked at him sideways. "Did you?" He didn't smile, but his voice had the warmth in it. "I thought I might." She didn't press the point. She had enough to think about. They reached town as the sun was going down behind the San Andres, turning the sky above the mountains into something extraordinary, deep orange shading up into rose, and then into the deep blue of coming evening. And it was one of those moments of landscape that Clara had been beginning to understand as specific to this place. The way the light here did not simply fade, but staged a whole departure, elaborate and unself-conscious. Eli walked her back to the boarding house and stood at the gate with his hat in his hands, and before she went inside, Clara turned and said, "Thank you for coming out." "I'll always come," he said simply, and she went inside and stood in the hallway for a moment with her hand on the doorframe, because those 3 words had done something to the architecture of her interior life, and she needed a moment for the dust to settle. She told Mrs. Greer, because Mrs. Greer was the kind of woman who knew things already, and it was easier to confirm them than to pretend she didn't. Mrs. Greer poured them both a small glass of brandy from the bottle she kept for significant occasions and said, "Eli Calloway is the finest man in this county, and quite possibly the finest man I have met in my 52 years on this earth. He is also the most cautious about being hurt because he has been, and he will take time. Don't rush him and don't scare him off by needing too much too fast. He's worth whatever patience it takes." "What happened to him?" Clara asked. Mrs. Greer swirled her brandy. "He was engaged to a young woman from Albuquerque 3 years ago. She decided that life on a ranch in New Mexico territory was not what she wanted after all, and she told him so 1 week before the wedding. He didn't come into town for 6 months after that. When he did come back, he was quieter." Clara thought about this. She thought about a man becoming quieter not because joy had been taken out of him, but because he had learned to hold it more carefully. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, and she wasn't sure if she was saying it to Mrs. Greer or to herself or to the empty air in the direction of the Brennan Ranch. "Then I suspect he knows that," Mrs. Greer said, "or he wouldn't have been on that road." October came in with changing light and changing air, the kind of October that made the high desert look as though someone had lit it from within. The cottonwoods along the creek turned yellow, genuine blazing yellow, and their reflections in the shallow water made the creek look golden. Clara walked along it on mornings when she didn't have school duties and felt the specific pleasure of being somewhere that was becoming familiar, the pleasure of a place beginning to keep you. Eli had taken to riding into town on Thursdays as well as Fridays, and no one made mention of this except Mrs. Greer, who made mention of it only with the corner of her mouth. He took Clara riding one Saturday afternoon in October, which was understood between them as something more than a practical outing, even though neither of them named it as such. They rode north of town toward the Brennan land, along a ridge that looked out over the valley, and Eli pointed out the San Andres to the east and the Jornada del Muerto basin spreading south, and he spoke about the land the way he always did, with a precision that was also affection. And Clara listened and added her own observations, and found that this was one of the most genuinely pleasurable conversations she had ever had in her life, the two of them reading the landscape together like a shared book. They stopped on the ridge and watched the light change over the valley for a while in comfortable silence, and then Eli said, without particular preamble, "I want to be straightforward with you about something." "All right," she said. He was looking at the valley, not at her. "I have spent the last 3 years being very careful about what I let matter to me," he said. "I was good at it. I didn't think I wanted to stop being good at it. And," she said, he looked at her then, "and I find that I am no longer as good at it as I was." The mountains went purple in the eastern distance, and the valley below them was in shadow, and the sky above them was the color of Clara's mother's old blue dress, deep and clear and honest. "I'm glad," she said. He exhaled just slightly, like a man who has been holding something and sets it down. "I know you've come out of something hard," he said. "I don't want to rush you. I don't want you to feel like—" "Eli," she said. He stopped. "I came out of something hard," she said, "but I have been out of it for some months now, and I know my own mind. I have known my own mind for quite some time. It is the first thing Gerald could not take from me because he could not find it." He looked at her with an expression that had something raw and real in it, something that sat right beneath the surface of his characteristic composure, and she understood in that moment that this man's quietness was not distance. It was depth. "Clara," he said, and the way he said her name was different from how anyone had said it before, like it was something he had been holding carefully and was finally allowed to set down gently. "Yes," she said preemptively, and he looked surprised for just a second before he understood that she was not answering a question he had asked, but one that existed between them already, a question that had been building since a general store counter, and a morning coffee, and a dusty road, and the specific comfort of his presence on a horse beside her when her hands would not stop shaking. He leaned across the distance between their horses and he kissed her, and it was brief and deliberate, and in the open air of the ridge, with the mountains going purple and the valley in shadow. And it was the most genuinely voluntary thing Clara Whitfield had experienced in her adult life. They rode back to town as the stars were beginning to come out, unhurried, with the occasional brush of their horses' flanks against each other, and a new ease in the silence between them that was different from the old ease, fuller, more inhabited. Mrs. Greer saw their faces when they came in for supper and said nothing at all, but she brought out her good china for dinner without any apparent occasion, and the look she gave Eli when she put his coffee down had 10 years of hope in it. November was a transformation, both in the land and in Clara. The days grew short and cold, and the nights were brilliant with stars that had no competition from anything below them, the sky here being darker and more total than any sky Clara had seen before. She was warm in Mrs. Greer's boarding house, and warm in the schoolhouse with the children, and warm in the particular way that a person is warm when they are beginning to know where they are going and to like the direction. Eli courted her with the same deliberateness he brought to everything, not formally in the stilted way she had once known from Gerald's world of social obligation and display, but genuinely, in the way of a man who was interested in who she was and wanted her to know who he was, and believed that these two things were the primary business between them. He brought her books from the ranch that had belonged to the elder Mr. Brennan, who had been an educated man, and they argued about the books with great enjoyment because Clara had strong opinions, and Eli had the lovely quality of being genuinely willing to be wrong when he was. He told her about his family in Texas, his mother who still ran a small household in a town outside Austin, his younger brother who had gone into a dry goods business, his father who had died when Eli was 17, and whose death had sent him drifting north on the cattle drive that eventually deposited him in New Mexico territory. He told her these things the way a man tells a woman things when he has made a decision about her, giving her the pieces of himself without ceremony, but with the full weight of their meaning. She told him about her mother, who had been the kind of woman that capable women are sometimes crushed into being, someone whose intelligence and vitality had been pressed into an ever smaller space by the requirements of her life, until only the hard, bright center remained, and who had died when Clara was 21 with so many things unexpressed that Clara sometimes felt them like a physical inheritance. She told him this and he listened without trying to fix it or minimize it, and then he said, "She gave you the comb." Clara blinked. "How did you know about the comb? Mrs. Greer mentioned you have a tortoiseshell comb that you're very careful with." Mrs. Greer talks too much, Clara said. "She does," he agreed, "but she only talks about things she loves." One Friday in the middle of November, Clara was at the schoolhouse after hours grading the children's arithmetic exercises when the door opened, and it was not Eli but Audrey Holt, who had been out at the far end of town doing something, and came in red-cheeked from the cold with news that the Decker trouble was moving in a direction that had the whole north end of the county tense. Walt Decker had filed a complaint with the Territorial Land Office, claiming that the western boundary of the Brennan spread had been incorrectly surveyed 15 years ago, and that approximately 200 acres of what James Brennan believed to be his land was actually public domain, which would make it available for Decker to claim. The land surveyor Fletcher, who was still boarding at Mrs. Greer's, had been privately engaged by Decker to support this claim, which explained both his continued presence in Dusty Creek and a certain evasiveness in his manner that Clara had attributed to temperament. "Everyone's saying there could be real trouble over it," Audrey said, sitting down and wrapping her hands around the warmth of the small iron stove. "Mr. Brennan is elderly and his health is not strong, and if he loses that land it could bankrupt the operation." Clara thought about Eli. The Brennan spread was everything to him, not just work but the place he had built himself into over 8 years, the land he knew better than anything. She went back to the boarding house that evening and found Mrs. Greer in the kitchen with a tight expression. "You've heard," Clara said. "Fletcher came in for his things this afternoon," Mrs. Greer said. "He's moved to the hotel on Decker's account. I'm glad enough to be rid of him, but it troubles me what it means." On Friday morning, Eli came in for his coffee, and he was quiet with a different quality than his usual quiet, a tighter, more compressed stillness. Clara sat across from him with her own coffee and said, "Tell me." He looked at her. "You've heard." "Audrey told me." He put his cup down and ran a hand over the back of his neck. "The survey claim is complicated," he said. "Fletcher did the original measurement, and he is now saying the east line was placed 300 yards too far west. If the Territorial Office accepts his new survey, we lose the water access on that side. Without that water, we can't run anything close to the number of cattle the operation needs to be viable. Is Brennan going to fight it?" "He wants to," Eli said. "He's 71 years old and his heart is not good and he wants to fight everything, which is how he got to be 71, but I don't want him putting himself in the ground over it. The law is going to take this to the Territorial Court in Las Cruces, and that's months away at the earliest. What can be done in the meantime?" He looked at her with something that was not quite surprise but was appreciation. "The ranch's own records go back to the original 1868 survey," he said. "If someone with a mind for documents and careful reading could go through them and find any inconsistencies in Fletcher's claim, there'd be grounds to challenge his methodology before it even gets to court." "I have a mind for documents and careful reading," Clara said. He held her gaze. "I know you do," he said. "I was building to asking." "You don't have to build to anything with me," she said. He smiled then, a full genuine smile that was still uncommon enough from him that it felt like a gift every time. "I'll bring the record Saturday," he said. He brought the records Saturday in a leather satchel, and Clara spread them across the long table in Mrs. Greer's dining room with the afternoon light coming in, and went through them with the same methodical attention she brought to the children's arithmetic. She had a natural aptitude for numerical logic and for spotting where sequences broke down, and within 2 hours she had found 3 instances in Fletcher's new survey documentation where his claimed measurements were internally inconsistent, places where the numbers he had recorded could not all be true simultaneously because they described geometric relationships that did not add up. She explained this to Eli, and he leaned over the table beside her, looking at the pages with his arm brushing hers, and said, very quietly, "Clara, that's it. That's the challenge. He made errors he can't explain away. Or he made them deliberately," she said. "Either way, they're errors on paper and the court will see them." She stayed at the table until the light gave out and Mrs. Greer lit the lamps, and then she wrote out a clear summary of her findings in her neat, precise hand, and Eli sat across from her watching her write with an expression that made Mrs. Greer, passing through with the evening coffee, quietly smile to herself. The documents were sent to Las Cruces with a letter from James Brennan's lawyer in early December, and the land dispute was formally referred to the territorial court with a note that Fletcher's survey methodology was under challenge. It would still take time, but the ground had shifted. Eli came into town the following Friday, and when Clara opened the boarding house door she found him standing on the front step with his hat in his hands and a small bunch of late-season wildflowers that he must have found somewhere in the remaining patches of sheltered ground, yellow and pale purple, already slightly frost-touched. "Those are nearly dead," she said. "They are not at their best," he agreed, "but they were the best I could find in December in New Mexico territory." She took them and put them in water, and they lasted another 2 days, which she thought was more determination than they had any right to, and she kept the dried husks of them in a small cup on the windowsill, because she was a woman who valued things that persisted past what was expected of them. December was cold and brilliant, with frost on the ground every morning that burned off by 10 o'clock and left the air glass-clear. The children at school were distracted by the approaching holidays, and Clara spent a Friday helping them make paper decorations and listening to their chaotic explanations of their family Christmases, stories of crowded houses and family disputes, and the particular wildness of children who have been cooped up too long with cold weather and not enough space. It struck her, listening to them, that she did not know what her own Christmas would look like. She had not had a Christmas she genuinely enjoyed since her mother died. Gerald had not been sentimental about holidays. She thought about a Christmas in this small, clean room at Mrs. Greer's, and then she thought about a Christmas somewhere else, somewhere that was becoming imaginable in a way it had not been even 2 months ago, and she let herself think about it with a fullness she had not previously permitted herself. On Christmas Eve, Mrs. Greer organized a supper at the boarding house that included, in addition to the boarders, Eli and James Brennan himself, who had come into town from the ranch against his doctor's advice and was magnificently unapologetic about it. Mr. Brennan was a small, fierce, white-haired man with the presence of someone who had shaped a significant piece of the world to his will and intended to go on doing so. He sat at the head of Mrs. Greer's table and looked at Clara with the focused assessment of a man who had spent his life reading land and weather and the character of people he was thinking of trusting. "You're the one who found the errors in Fletcher's survey," he said to her, not as a question. "Yes, sir," she said. "Good work," he said. "Eli told me what you found and how you found it. That's sound thinking." He looked at her a moment longer. "You're staying." "Yes, sir," she said, and it was the first time she had said it as a certainty rather than a likelihood, and she was aware of Eli hearing it from across the table and of something in him going still in the particular way that meant he was holding something carefully. After supper, when Mr. Brennan had gone to his hotel room and Mrs. Greer and Pete Dawson had retired and Audrey was in her room, Clara and Eli sat by the fire in the boarding house sitting room, not talking much, because the fire and the cold outside and the quality of the night did not require talking, and eventually Eli said, "Clara." "Yes," she said, and this time it was the other kind, the waiting kind. "I want to build something," he said, "with you. I want to ask you properly, and I mean to do that properly, but tonight I want you to know that it's where I'm headed, that when I ask, it won't be a surprise, but it will be genuine." She looked at the fire. "I want to build something too," she said. "I've never wanted to build anything with anyone before. I want to now." He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, and they sat like that for a while with the fire settling and the cold pressing at the windows and the stars overhead impossibly clear and numerous. And Clara thought that she had spent a great deal of her life in spaces that were too small for her, and that this place, this spare and honest and beautiful country, was the first place that had ever felt appropriately sized. January arrived with real cold, the kind of cold that the high desert could deliver with no warning and no apology, hard freezes that locked the creek and turned the ground iron hard underfoot and drove the cattle down to the lower pastures, where the ranch hands broke ice in the water troughs twice a day. Eli was at the ranch more than he was in town during January, the winter work being demanding, but he rode in on Friday mornings without exception, and he wrote her letters on the other days, which she had not expected from him, and which moved her in a way she could not entirely articulate. His letters were not flowery. They were entirely Eli, clear and direct and observant, descriptions of the winter work and the behavior of the cattle and the particular quality of starlight on snow-dusted ground, interspersed with thoughts about things she had said or things he had read, and occasionally, briefly, things he felt. Those were the lines she read more than once. He wrote about her the way he spoke about the land, with precision that was also affection, as if she were something that deserved to be described accurately, because accuracy was the deepest form of respect. She wrote back, and found that she too had more to say on paper than she sometimes had in person, that the letters between them filled in spaces that conversation left and conversation filled in spaces that letters left, and that between the two forms they were becoming very thoroughly known to each other. The territorial court date for the land dispute was set for March in Las Cruces. Fletcher had retreated from Dusty Creek when it became clear that his methodology was going to be challenged, and Walt Decker had become notably less aggressive about his boundary claims in the weeks following the legal filing. The community read this as the situation resolving in the Brennan operations favor even before the court date, which was how small communities read things when the momentum shifts. James Brennan's health, which had been concerning through the winter, improved somewhat in February, to everyone's relief. He rode into town on the second Friday of the month and had coffee with Eli and Clara together at Mrs. Greer's table, and by the end of the morning he had offered Clara a permanent position managing the ranch records and correspondence, which had been handled by a series of unreliable temporary solutions for years, and which he said, with the blunt pragmatism of an old man who has no patience for anything that doesn't work, needed someone competent. "I am not sentimental about the arrangement," he said. "You are competent. The position needs filling. The salary is $20 a month, and there's a small house on the north end of the property that goes with the job." Clara looked at him, and then at Eli, who was looking at the table with the particular careful neutrality of a man who has had nothing to do with an arrangement and is very invested in how it turns out. "I'd be honored," she said. Mr. Brennan nodded once, as though this was the obvious outcome and the conversation could now move on to other matters. Eli continued looking at the table for another moment before looking up and meeting her eyes with an expression that was, for him, extraordinarily unguarded. She started work for Mr. Brennan in the first week of March, riding out to the ranch 3 days a week to manage the record books and handle the correspondence that the operation generated, correspondence with suppliers and buyers, and the territorial land office and the Las Cruces lawyer. The small house that went with the job was a two-room structure with a proper hearth and a wooden floor and a window that looked east toward the mountains. And it was hers, entirely hers, the first private space she had ever occupied that was genuinely her own. She moved her valise out from Mrs. Greer's boarding house on a Thursday morning with the full ceremony the occasion deserved, which was to say that Mrs. Greer hugged her and made no effort to prevent the single tear that made its way down her iron-gray cheek, and Pete Dawson said, "Good luck." Then, with more warmth than his face typically expressed, and Audrey Holt gave her a jar of preserved plums from the boarding house pantry, because she was Audrey, and she expressed emotion in provisions. The small house was very clean and very quiet on the first night, and Clara sat by the fire after supper and was profoundly happy, which was not a state she had much experience with, and which she therefore observed with some attention, wanting to understand its particular qualities so she could recognize it reliably in future. The Las Cruces court proceeding in mid-March went in the Brennan operation's favor, as the mounting evidence of inconsistency in Fletcher's survey work was sufficient to discredit his amended claim entirely. The original 1868 survey was upheld. Walt Decker did not take the ruling gracefully, but he did take it, and the practical result was that the Brennan operation's water access was secure, and the ranch's viability was no longer under threat. Eli came to find her when he got back from Las Cruces on the evening of the court date, and he tied his horse at the rail outside her little house and knocked, and when she opened the door he said, "We won." And the look on his face was not triumph but relief, the relief of a man who had been holding a great weight upright for months and could finally let it rest. "Come in," she said. "I'll make coffee." He came in and sat at her small table, and she made coffee on her little iron stove, and they talked until the fire burned low about the ranch and what the ruling meant and what Mr. Brennan intended to do with the next several years of the operation. And the conversation had the specific quality of shared investment, the pleasure of two people who have a stake in the same good outcome. When the fire was truly low and the night was deep around the house, Eli stood to go, and at the door he turned, and Clara thought she saw him make a decision. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and produced a small ring, a simple thing, a gold band with a small turquoise stone set into it, and the turquoise was the color of the sky over Dusty Creek on a clear morning, the particular irreplaceable blue of this country. "I told you it wouldn't be a surprise," he said. "But I want to do it properly." She looked at the ring and then at his face, at those rain-colored eyes that were entirely open and entirely serious, and at his hands that were steady and patient where hers had once shaken. "Clara Whitfield," he said, "I have no interest in the rest of my life unless you are in it. I want to marry you. I want you to be my wife. I want to build a home in this place with you, and I want to be with you every morning of every year I have left in this world. I am asking you plainly, and I will wait as long as you need." "You won't have to wait," she said. "Yes, Eli, yes." He put the ring on her finger and she looked at the turquoise, and it was exactly the right thing, exactly the kind of thing that could only have come from him, chosen not for its monetary value or its social statement, but because it was the color of the sky over the place where they had both decided to belong. He held her hands and she held his, there in the doorway of her little house with the high desert cold pressing all around them and the stars brilliant overhead, and he kissed her with the same deliberateness he brought to everything, and it was thorough and honest and warm and everything that had not been present in the 4 years before. They were married in the first week of May 1884 in the Dusty Creek Church with the Leaning Bell Tower, which was the right place to be married, Clara thought, because a church that leaned a little was a church that knew about the persistence of imperfect things. Mrs. Greer stood with Clara, and James Brennan stood with Eli, and Audrey Holt cried with an enthusiasm that she made no effort to moderate, and Pete Dawson attended in his Sunday coat, and appeared genuinely moved, which surprised everyone including Pete Dawson. Deputy Cal Briggs stood at the back and beamed with the uncomplicated goodwill of a man who enjoys occasions. The Reverend McCann, who was a practical man with a good understanding of what was actually important in the ceremonies he conducted, kept the service to the essential things, and when he got to the moment when Eli said, "I do," he said it with a quietness and a certainty that Clara felt in the center of her chest like a bell being struck. The reception was in Mrs. Greer's boarding house dining room, cleared of its usual furniture and filled with half the town, because small western towns take their celebrations seriously and find every occasion they can to exercise the capacity. There was music from a fiddle player named Joe Reyes who played with the kind of joy that makes your feet move before your mind has made any decision about it. And there was food from every household in a 3-mile radius, and there was dancing on the wooden floor until the night was very late. Clara danced with Eli and thought that they were good at it together, the rhythm between them easy and natural, the way things are between people who have learned to read each other. They rode out to the ranch together in the late night, under the stars, with the desert quiet and cold around them and the lights of Dusty Creek going small behind them, and Clara looked at the shape of the Brennan land against the sky and thought, "Mine." Not in the way of ownership but in the way of belonging, which is different and better. They moved into the small house together, and it expanded to accommodate 2 people with the flexibility that small spaces have when the people in them are glad of each other's company. Eli built a proper bookshelf along the east wall for the growing collection of books between them, and Clara put curtains up at the windows that she made herself from blue cotton that was the color of nothing in particular except that she liked it. And by June, the house had the quality of a place that has been lived in with intention, warm and specific and irreplaceable. The summer of 1884 was a full one. Clara continued managing the Brennan Ranch records and had expanded the role to include correspondence with the several new buyers Mr. Brennan was cultivating as the operation grew in confidence with the land dispute resolved. Eli ran the ranch operations with his characteristic steady competence, and Mr. Brennan, whose health had stabilized in the spring warmth, spent more time than he had in years riding the land he had fought to keep. There were difficulties, as there always are. The summer was drier than the previous year, and the water management on the ranch required constant attention. One of the ranch hands, a young man named Diego Torres who had been with the operation for 2 years, was injured when a section of the old south fence gave way while he was repairing it, the same fence that had tangled Sid on Decker's operation months ago. The injury was to his arm and was serious but not permanent, and Clara organized the care arrangements with the efficiency she brought to everything practical, coordinating with the town doctor and making sure Diego's family, who lived an hour's ride south, was notified and had accommodation while he recovered. It was during Diego's recovery that she began to understand the community of the ranch more fully, the way the hands and their families formed a small world within the larger world of the territory, with their own habits and histories and loyalties. Diego's wife, Maria, was sharp and funny and spoke her mind with a directness Clara found entirely refreshing, and they became friends in the way that competent women sometimes become friends quickly, recognizing in each other a fundamental pragmatism that makes the friendship efficient from the start. Maria told her things about the ranch's history and about the territories that filled in the picture Clara was still assembling. She told her about the Apache bands that had moved through this country before the territorial changes of the last decade, about the treaties that had been broken, and the people who had been displaced from land they had known for generations, about the particular injustice of the way that conquest arranged itself as policy, and then as simple fact, until the people it had dispossessed were discussed in the past tense, even by people who meant well. Clara listened to this with the attention she gave to things that mattered. She had come from a world, Santa Fe's social circles, that had the luxury of not thinking about these things if it chose not to, and she had arrived in a place where the land itself was a record of everything that had happened on it. She thought about belonging and what it meant to belong to a place that had already belonged to others, and she did not think there were easy answers, but she thought that the discomfort of the question was the appropriate state for an honest person. She talked to Eli about it, and he listened with the seriousness it deserved and said, "I think about it too. I don't think it can be undone. But I think the people who are here now are responsible for what happens next, and what happens next should be something we're not ashamed of. Is what's happening now something we're not ashamed of?" "Some of it," he said. "Not all of it. The Decker operation treats its Apache workers like tools. The Brennan operation treats everyone who works here like people. That's a distinction that matters even if it doesn't fix the larger thing." They were on the ridge north of the ranch when they had this conversation, the same ridge where he had first kissed her, and the valley was below them in the afternoon light, beautiful and complicated, the way places that have history are always beautiful and complicated. That autumn brought a particular happiness that Clara had not anticipated, though she should have. In October, 2 weeks after the anniversary of that day on the road when her hands had shaken, and she had found she wasn't afraid anymore, she understood that she was carrying a child. She told Eli in the evening after supper, sitting at the table in the warm light of the lamp, and he was very still for a moment in the way he was still when something had reached deep enough to bypass his composure, and then he looked at her with everything he felt entirely visible on his face. "Clara," he said. "Yes," she said, for the third kind of yes. He came around the table and crouched beside her chair and took her hands in his, and looked at her with those rain-colored eyes that were, she had discovered over the months, also the color of green things and of deep water and of everything that grew in the desert after rain, and he said, "I am going to be so careful with you." "You don't need to be careful," she said. "I am not fragile." "No," he agreed, "but you are precious, and that's different." She put her hand on his face, and he turned into it like a man who has learned to receive what is offered without bracing against it, and the lamp light moved on the walls of their small house, and outside the high desert was dark and enormous and full of stars, and inside it was entirely sufficient. Mrs. Greer, when told, produced the brandy immediately and then sat down and said, "Good. The world needs more careful, honest people, and I believe you two are going to produce them." Mr. Brennan said, with the bluntness that was his form of affection, "The operation will need more hands in 20 years. This is forward planning." Audrey Holt cried again. Pete Dawson said, "Good luck," then, with more feeling than usual. The winter of 1884 into 1885 was the warmest winter Clara could have hoped for in terms of internal life. She continued working through the pregnancy because she saw no compelling reason not to, managing the records and correspondence from the little house with the blue curtains, and Eli organized the ranch work around the knowledge that she was less mobile than usual with a thoughtfulness that was practical and affectionate in equal measure. He read to her in the evenings from whatever they were currently working through, with the same voice that had first made her understand that a man's quietness could be a form of richness rather than absence, and she listened to him read and thought that she was entirely content, which was not the same as happiness, which was an active state, but was its own important thing, a deep still pool of rightness at the center of everything. The child was born in June of 1885, a boy, loud and healthy and specific from the first moment, and they named him Samuel James Calloway, the James for Mr. Brennan, who received the news with a suspension of his characteristic bluntness that lasted almost 30 seconds before he recovered himself, and said that it was a fine name and that Samuel had better have a good head for numbers. Samuel did, it turned out, but that was something they would learn over years rather than days. In the first days after Samuel's birth, Clara lay in the bedroom of the little house and let the world be as small as it needed to be. The house smelled of summer, dry grass and pine from the woodpile outside, and the particular warm-bred smell of new child. And Eli came in and out with the focused competence of a man who has decided that this is the work that matters most. Bringing water and clean cloths and food she was too tired to ask for. Talking to Samuel in the low, even voice that the baby seemed to find as restful as Clara always had. "You are remarkable," she told Eli on the third day, watching him settle Samuel against his chest with the natural ease of a man who had apparently understood instinctively how to hold a small person. "I'm just paying attention," he said. "That's the remarkable part," she said. He looked at her over the top of Samuel's head with that expression that was, after a year of marriage, still capable of making something turn over in her chest, and said, "You are the most remarkable person I have ever known. I need you to know that." "I know it," she said. "You tell me in 100 ways every day." "I want to be sure you hear it in words too," he said. "I hear it," she said, "in words and in everything else." The summer of 1885 settled over the Brennan Ranch and Dusty Creek like a warm hand, generous and unhurried. Samuel grew with the enthusiasm of a person who has decided that existence is interesting and wants to investigate all of it. He was a sociable baby, accepting of everyone who held him, and he responded to Diego Torres' deep voice with particular approval, which Diego found very gratifying. Mr. Brennan came to see Samuel on a warm July morning and held him with the stiff, careful tenderness of an elderly man who knows how breakable small things are, and looked at him for a long time. "He has your eyes," he said to Eli. "He has Clara's stubbornness," Eli said. "That will serve him better than my eyes," Clara said. Mr. Brennan laughed, the full and genuine laugh of a man who has outlasted enough hard things to know that joy is not frivolous. It was one of the few times Clara had heard him laugh like that, and she stored it away. James Brennan died in the autumn of 1885, on a morning in October when the cottonwoods were yellow again along the creek, and the air was the sharp crystalline quality that Clara associated now with this particular season in this particular place. He died in his sleep at the ranch, which was, the doctor said, the most peaceful exit a man of his constitution could have hoped for, and which, when Clara allowed herself to feel it, felt like the land itself had decided to take him back gently. His will, which had been drawn up the previous spring in Las Cruces with a precision that reflected the man who had written it, left the Brennan operation to Eli Calloway, in full, with the condition that the names of the hands currently employed be maintained in employment for no less than 2 years if they wished it, and that the records of the ranch be maintained with the same diligence they had been managed under Clara Calloway's tenure. The reading of the will was conducted in the ranch's main room by the Las Cruces lawyer, and Clara sat beside Eli and felt him absorb it in the same way he absorbed everything significant, quietly and completely, and afterward, when everyone had gone and it was just the two of them in that room, he sat for a long time looking at the window. "I didn't expect it," he said. "I know," she said. "He never said. In 8 years he never said anything that made me think." "He said it in everything else," Clara said gently. "The way he trusted you, the way he talked about the ranch when he was talking to you. You were his, Eli. You were the thing he built his last years toward." Eli put his face in his hands for a moment. It was the only time she had seen him do that, and she put her arm around him and let him have it, the grief and the weight and the overwhelming specificity of being loved by someone and then losing them. And she held him until the moment passed and he straightened and put his hands down and was himself again, though a slightly different self, one that carried one more thing. "We have work to do," he said. "We do," she agreed. They ran the ranch together in the months that followed with a partnership that was practical and equal, and built on the specific foundation of two people who understood each other's strengths and trusted each other's judgment. Eli made the decisions about the cattle and the land and the physical operation with the same steady competence he always had. Clara managed the records and correspondence and began to expand the operation's reach. negotiating with buyers in Albuquerque, and El Paso with a confidence in her own competence that had been growing since the day she spotted the errors in Fletcher's survey. Diego Torres recovered his full use of his arm by the following spring and became one of Eli's most trusted hands, and the friendship between Clara and Maria Torres deepened into the kind of friendship that is, functionally, family, meals shared, and children supervised and opinions exchanged with the frank affection of people who have decided they belong to each other's lives. Samuel's first steps happened on a Tuesday afternoon in the kitchen of the ranch house, which they had moved into in the late autumn after taking time to make it their own, not replacing what had been Brennan's but building alongside it. Their books next to his on the shelves, Clara's blue curtains in the bedroom windows, Samuel's small presence filling rooms that had been too quiet for too long. Eli was at the table with the ranch's accounts when Samuel let go of the chair leg he had been gripping and took 3 wide-legged triumphant steps across the kitchen floor. And Eli looked up at exactly the right moment and saw it. And the expression on his face was one of such pure and uncomplicated joy that Clara thought it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She had a photograph taken in Las Cruces the following spring, the 3 of them, herself and Eli with Samuel between them and the mountains somewhere in the middle distance behind them, because she wanted to have it to keep, wanted to be able to show Samuel later what this time had looked like, this time of beginning. By 1887, Dusty Creek had grown somewhat. 2 new families arrived and took up smaller ranching operations to the west. The church got its bell tower properly straightened by a carpenter from Santa Fe who was passing through, and accepted the job on the grounds that a leaning tower offended his professional dignity. A second general store opened at the north end of the main street with a young couple from Colorado at the helm who were energetic about their enterprise. And the school had expanded under Audrey Holt's passionate direction to include a second room for the older students. Clara donated a shelf of books to the school library, including several from the Brennan Ranch collection that she knew James Brennan would have approved of the destination for, and Audrey put a small paper label on each one that read donated by the Calloway family. And Clara looked at that label and thought about names and ownership, and the things you leave behind in a place when you have loved it faithfully. In the summer of 1887, she told Eli about the second child with the same directness she brought to everything, sitting on the porch of the ranch house in the evening with Samuel asleep inside and the high desert going dark around them, blue to purple to the deep pure black that preceded the stars. He took her hand across the porch rail and held it. "Are you well?" he asked first, because that was always first with him. "Very well," she said. "Good," he said. He turned her hand over in his and looked at her ring in the failing light, the turquoise stone that was still the color of morning sky. "I am going to spend my whole life not being able to adequately express what you mean to me," he said. "You express it fine," she said. "You express it every morning when you bring me coffee before I ask, and every evening when you come in from the work and you look for me first thing every time." "I always look for you first thing," he said. "I know," she said. "That's what I mean." The second child was born in February 1888, a girl this time, arriving in the middle of a light snowfall that dusted the ranch house roof and the porch railing and the mountains in the east, and she was placed in Clara's arms with the same sense of irreversible rightness that Samuel had been, this specific and fierce and entirely herself new person. They named her Rose Eliza Calloway, the Eliza for Mrs. Greer, who was informed by letter, and who responded with a letter that was 4 pages of uncharacteristic expressiveness, and a small package containing the jar of preserved plums she had apparently been saving since Audrey's original gift. Samuel, who was now 2.5 and a person with very decided opinions, inspected Rose with a seriousness that suggested he was reserving judgment, and then very gently placed one small hand on her head and looked up at Eli with an expression that seemed to say, "All right then," and moved on to other business. Mrs. Greer came to visit in the spring when the roads were clear, her first visit to the ranch, and she stood in the kitchen of the ranch house and looked around at the blue curtains and the bookshelves and the evidence of a life being lived with thoroughness and care. And she did not produce the brandy this time because she had not brought it, but her expression contained its equivalent. "You're happy," she said to Clara. It was not a question. "Completely," Clara said. "Good," Mrs. Greer said. She looked at Eli, who was in the yard with Samuel demonstrating the operation of the water pump. "He's happy too." "He is," Clara said. "He smiles now, quite regularly. Did you know that about him?" "I always knew he had it in him," Mrs. Greer said. "It just needed the right person to make it seem worth the effort." They drank tea on the porch in the April sunshine and watched Eli chase Samuel around the yard, with the unbounded enthusiasm of a large man playing with a small child who has more energy than either of them. And Clara held Rose in the crook of her arm and felt the specific fullness of the moment. Not the temporary fullness of a good day, but the abiding fullness of a life that had been built deliberately on good ground, with good materials and the steady application of everything she had. That evening, after the children were asleep and Mrs. Greer had retired to the guest room and the house was quiet in the particular night quiet of the desert, Clara and Eli sat by the fire, as they had that first Christmas Eve in the boarding house sitting room, and the fire settled, and the cold pressed at the windows, and the stars were outside doing their usual magnificent work, and Eli put his arm around her, and she leaned into him with the ease of a woman who has found the place that fits her. "Do you remember the ridge?" he said. "The day you kissed me," she said. "Of course I remember. I have thought about that moment so many times," he said, "about what it took for me to lean across and do that. I was terrified." She looked up at him with real surprise. "You were, completely," he said, and he was using her word and she heard it. "I was holding about 3 years of very careful not caring and trying to dismantle it on a ridge in October while talking about mountains, and I was not sure I had the nerve." "You didn't seem terrified," she said. "I was very still," he said. "When I'm terrified, I go very still." She thought about this, about two people on a ridge, both of them carrying things, both of them going toward each other despite the weight of what they carried. "I was a little terrified too," she said. "Not of you, of wanting something that much again." "And now," he said. She listened to the fire settle and felt his arm around her and thought about the children asleep in the next room and the land outside and the years behind them and the years ahead. And she thought about a woman on a horse with shaking hands who had discovered she was not afraid anymore, and about how that had been the first moment of something that had become this. "Now I am not afraid at all," she said, "of any of it." He pressed his lips to her hair. "Neither am I," he said. "Not anymore." The years that followed were full ones. The ranch grew under their management into something that James Brennan would have recognized and been proud of. A lean and well-run operation that treated the land with respect, and the people who worked it with dignity. And that produced enough to sustain itself, and everyone connected to it, without requiring the kind of aggressive expansion that the Decker operation had attempted, and that had not, in the long run, made anyone in the Decker family particularly happy. Walt Decker sold his operation in 1889 and moved to Albuquerque, and the land was bought by a family named Ortega who ran sheep and kept their fences mended and were good neighbors in all the ways that mattered. Diego Torres and his family put down permanent roots in the small house on the south end of the Callaway Ranch, which Eli had improved and expanded as thanks for Diego's loyalty and work over the years, and which was legally granted to Diego in a document that Clara drew up herself with all the careful language she had learned from years of managing the ranch's affairs. Samuel grew into himself with the steady purposefulness of a child who knows what he is curious about, which in his case was everything mechanical and everything living in roughly equal measure. And by the time he was 8, he was following Eli around the ranch asking questions about the cattle and the land at a rate that required a certain stamina to keep up with. Eli answered every question with the patience of a man who believes that curiosity is among the most important things a person can have. Rose developed her own fierce intelligence along her own particular lines, and it became clear early that her strengths were not unlike her mother's: a deep, orderly precision with numbers and a penetrating attention to the logic of things, combined with a social ease that Clara traced directly to the warmth of her upbringing and the example of a father who listened to people with his full attention. Mrs. Greer remained in Dusty Creek, presiding over her boarding house with the same iron grace until she was well into her 60s. And then she did something that surprised everyone and surprised herself most of all. She sold the boarding house to Audrey Holt, who had always loved the big dining room table and had privately imagined expanding the school into a proper boarding institution for children from outlying ranches, and Mrs. Greer moved to the Callaway Ranch. This was Eli's suggestion and Clara's immediate agreement. They built a proper addition to the ranch house with a sitting room and a bedroom and a porch facing west toward the sunsets, and Mrs. Greer moved into it in the spring of 1891 and spent her days doing exactly what she pleased, which was considerable, and being the kind of grandmother figure to Samuel and Rose that neither Eli nor Clara had been able to offer them from their own families: steady and sharp and full of stories and entirely unsentimental about it. "You built a good life," Mrs. Greer said to Clara one evening on the west porch, watching the sun go down behind the land with the colors doing their usual extravagant work. "We built it," Clara said. "You and Eli and me and everyone who helped." "You made the decisions," Mrs. Greer said. "We made them together," Clara said. Mrs. Greer looked at her with those sharp black eyes that had seen a great many things over a great many years. "You know what I mean," she said. "You are the kind of woman who needed to be somewhere that let you be yourself fully. Not every woman gets that. You did." Clara looked out at the land that she had come to through necessity and stayed in through love, the dry and beautiful and honest landscape that had been the first place to feel appropriately sized for her, and she thought about a woman in a borrowed saddle riding away from one life and toward a life she couldn't see yet. "I got very lucky," she said. "You also rode toward the luck," Mrs. Greer said. "That matters too." Eli came out onto the porch with coffee for all three of them and Samuel at his heels, asking something detailed about the stars, and he looked at Clara in the gathering dark with the same expression he had had the day he asked her to marry him, thoroughly and unreservedly present, and she looked back at him with everything she was. The stars came out over the high desert one by one, and then all at once, as they always did in that country, with the unqualified generosity of a sky that has nothing between itself and you. And the air was cool and clean with the particular quality of the desert at evening that she now knew as home, and the voices around her were the voices of the people she loved most in this world. And Clara Calloway sat on the west porch of the ranch that was hers in every sense of the word, and let herself be exactly where she was. She thought once more about the moment on the road, the shaking hands and the quiet voice beside her, and the realization that had come out of nowhere and meant everything. She had been afraid for so long before that moment, afraid in the way you are afraid when your life is not your own, when you are always waiting for the next thing to go wrong, when your body braces itself as a matter of habit against the impact of days you didn't choose. And then she had not been afraid anymore. And the not being afraid had been the beginning, the first day of the particular life that had brought her to this porch with this coffee, and these stars, and this man and these children, and this wide and honest and enduring country that did not make promises it couldn't keep, and did not ask you to be anything other than what you were. Samuel climbed into Eli's lap with a child's complete certainty that this was a perfectly reasonable thing to do to a grown man in the middle of a conversation, and Eli wrapped an arm around him and kept talking about the stars, pointing out the constellations with the same patient precision he brought to explaining anything, and Clara watched them and thought, "This is what it looks like. This is what it looks like when the right life happens." Rose had fallen asleep inside, as was her habit, sudden and complete, and the evening was settling into full night, and Mrs. Greer stood to take her coffee inside and said good night with the brevity of a woman who knows when to leave well enough alone. And then it was just the three of them, Eli and Samuel and Clara, on the west porch with the stars spreading overhead in every direction. "Mama," Samuel said, from the safe territory of his father's lap, "are we going to be here forever?" Clara looked at the land and the sky and the man she had chosen and the child they had made and the life that was as solid and real as the mountains in the east. "Yes," she said, "we are going to be here for a very long time." Samuel seemed satisfied with this and returned to the business of the stars. Eli caught her eye over Samuel's head, and the look between them was brief and total. Everything said that had always been said between them, the full inventory of what they were to each other. She had ridden into Dusty Creek on a sorrel mare with $43 and a crack-spine Bible and her mother's comb, not knowing whether she was passing through or staying. She knew now. She had known, she thought, since a morning at a general store counter when a man had looked at her with rain-colored eyes and asked a genuine question, and listened to the genuine answer. She had known since a road in September and a pair of shaking hands and a voice that said her name like it was something worth saying carefully. She had known since a ridge in October and a turquoise sky and a man who leaned across the distance and chose her. She had not been afraid for a long time. She did not plan to start again. The high desert settled into the deep dark of its nights around them, vast and unhurried and beautiful, and the ranch was quiet and full and real. And Clara Calloway, who had once been Clara Whitfield, and before that simply Clara, who had once ridden away from everything she knew without knowing where she was going, sat on her porch in the dark and was entirely, completely, undeniably home.